Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jovencio de la Paz. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Art. I teach primarily in fibers. It is a pleasure to introduce you to Edie Fake, our visiting artist. Tonight's lecture is made possible by the generosity of Gay and Judy Davis, who founded the Davis Family Art Endowment Fund here at the University of Oregon College of Design. Mr. and Mrs. Davis are both graduates of the UO, and as are their daughters, Anne and Marie, and they are wonderful supporters of our art students, and we'd like to thank them for this opportunity to bring incredible artists and lecturers here every year. Before we begin tonight's program, I want to acknowledge that we have gathered here at the University of Oregon, which is located on the traditional homeland of the Kayapuy'a Ilihi. Edie Fake is an artist living and working in the Mojave Desert. Edie's paintings, drawings, and work in graphic novels consider themes of architecture, queer and trans embodiment, as well as dream and gem-like impossible spaces. The work occupies a speculative place between forms both familiar and sometimes alien, and use meticulous mark-making and pattern to draw the viewer into otherworldly sites of radical possibility and secret histories. Edie Fake's work has been widely exhibited with shows at the Berkeley Art Museum and Film Archive, the Everson Museum, the Drawing Center in New York, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, to name a few. Edie's graphic novels have been lauded with a variety of awards, including the prestigious 2011 Ignatz Award for an Outstanding Graphic Novel. Edie Fake is represented by Western Exhibitions in Chicago, Illinois, and the Broadway Gallery in New York. Please join me in welcoming Edie Fake.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you especially to Wendy and Jovencio for bringing me here in the Department of Art. What a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to be talking about making art and how that kind of collides with the way I want to live, and imagining queer space and imagining trans-utopic spaces. And I thought that this was a nice, maybe a childhood photograph to share with you all that is me in my favorite toy as a kid, which was this bag of rags, and thinking about this kind of fabulous and horrible bag of scraps that as a kid I would just sort through for hours and hours, still feels very relevant to the way I process the world today, and kind of trying to make sense of life and what's happening. My background in the arts, I had a formal arts education in film and animation at RISD around the turn of the century. And I think it changed me in this way because at the time Providence had a very active DIY punk scene that was manifesting itself through a lot of printmaking, comics making, a lot of people setting up their studios in their workspaces, also having venues in the same space. So it felt like a very activated time to be in Providence, thinking about art. And as I left school, I set out to be an animator, but quickly felt like I didn't have the resources for that in the real world. But then kind of thinking about that, it led me to drawing and having this kind of influence of an art scene in Providence that was so heavily based in comics and printmaking. I really gravitated towards these mediums because they were low resources at the time when I was pretty scrappy. Not that that's changed that much, but all I needed was paper and a pen to kind of make narratives instead of a camera and a little stand set up and film to make it on. I think the other thing, I was sort of part of this phase of filmmaking where things were shifting digital, and I was very much focused on making things with my hands, and really felt that that was part of how I think, both as as an artist and as a human. So I started making comics, and a big part of why I did that was because I was trying to process feelings of being trans and queer and non-binary in my own body, and figuring out what that meant in a time where the language for that was not necessarily queer and trans and non-binary. The language was very not present, I felt, and therefore, like, I really felt like I needed a lot of processing to figure out how my body fit into the world that I lived in. So I started drawing this character called Gaylord Phoenix, who has moves through kind of a fantastical world. And as you can see, these drawings are pretty like rough. They were done ballpoint pen on just copy paper, and I started putting out sort of this fantasy adventure of this queer birdman moving through space, having lots of sex, asking for help, getting into trouble, and sort of using this fantasy to build a space for a strangely gendered body in the world. And then I had moved to Chicago from Providence and was part of a queer art scene that was very active in Chicago, and kind of fell in with a bunch of artists working in a lot of different mediums. And this was the first time I started having these kind of conversations about what a trans body is, and how can that be defined outside of binaries, and how can we think about that in ways that feel true to our own identities. And so this was a strange experimental conference that we pulled together in a warehouse space on the south side of Chicago called Pilot TV. Instead of having a conference where there's a lot of panels, there's like lectures, we kind of leveraged friends who had access to art school equipment in Chicago, and got a bunch of cameras also from like thrift stores and things, and put together a conference that was instead people kind of setting up a autonomous television studio for like about a half a week. I think it was a 4-day conference. So people would propose television shows that they wanted to make around the theme of feminist trespass, and thinking about that in a way of how trans identities and feminist identities intersect, and also in like playful and messy and showy ways, like ways that could be a television show. And so the pilot conference ended up being part a Skillshare, where people were teaching each other how to use cameras and how to edit and make shows and do special effects, but also like a way to find a queer expression, and to kind of like celebrate the messiness of gender and put that into media format. So it was like an incredible collaborative work. It pulled in just like a lot of different artists working in a lot of different ways. And this is an inflatable television by the artist Flo McGarrell. I think I was in charge of the pilot wood sign that is right next to it. And this is set up next to a highway, which is next to the warehouse we were in. And sort of really solidified my commitment to queer community and also artistic weirdness, and finding ways to get to a messy idea. Meanwhile, my main practice at the time was comics, and so I had started putting out Gaylord Phoenix in about one issue every year. And as I was doing that, I was seeing that the narrative of Gaylord Phoenix, which is concocted in sort of a ever-changing fantasy world, that kind of the broadness of what a fantasy can be and what a wild world with like very little rules could do for a queer body, and how placing a little like fantasy into my life could create a space of imagining. and help me process things, help me process traumatic events, and also figuring out what my own gender was. And playing with the making of images of like how I wanted to be a person who draws things and collages things and puts things together. So for a long time, comics was sort of my medium of choice. And kind of growing out of both like the impulses of the pilot television conference and zines and comics that I was self-publishing at the time. This is myself and a dear friend, Lee Relvis, and we had both gotten small grants to put out zines, and we used those to put together kind of a queer utopian opera that we toured around. Lee has a voice like a songbird and did all of the singing. I have a voice like a baby seagull and mostly was there for like jokes. But also sort of this kind of touring with something that was unusual, touring with an opera based on a zine. It led us to different people's like homemade spaces. It led us to different galleries. And doing that physically carved out a network of friends that I have to this day. And meanwhile, the Adventures of Gaylord sort of led me into this place where I was beginning my own medical transition, and that meant navigating things that I necessarily didn't consider that I had all that access to, and making decisions that there wasn't that much information to gather. Things like having like a cosmetic chest surgery, gender-affirming chest surgery, things like taking hormones. And I found that by drawing things in the comics, like at the time I had to give myself a shot of testosterone, and kind of being able to have this like fantasy space to process that gesture. Here you see like Gaylord kind of at one point the character has to stab their own leg, and it releases a lot of kind of past memories. And so having this kind of fantasy space to process that in helped me put a lot into comics that I maybe didn't have words to, or a therapist to share with. And this is also around the same time that I started a tattoo apprenticeship. So it was this kind of cloud of life activity, and figuring out ways to work as an artist and have an artistic practice while making a living. It was this like conglomeration of my body very much changing and making decisions around that very quickly. Of learning this new way of drawing, tattooing, and it felt like it changed all the rules of art making for me, where I had to kind of re-examine how and why I drew things, as well as expanding why I drew things, like drawing things for other people, and sort of listening to what they wanted me to draw all the time. So that it was a great, it was a great way to understand like that a drawing can be a gift to someone, and it can be an individual gift, as in like designing a tattoo for someone, or it can be a community gift, like it can be a response to listening to what people are saying. I was living in San Francisco, and at thrift stores I would find, I had a collection of studded leather belts that I would find at all the gay thrift stores around town, which led me to thinking about a lot of them were kind of home fabricated with these lovely nicknames. So thinking about what studded leather looked like and felt like, and what it meant for like a queer community to have these kind of charming nicknames, which led me to a drawing technique that I was it was almost drawing for tattoos sort of opened up my lines, and then having this interest in drawing leather also tighten them up at the same time. And I found this, it's corny to say, but it was very much a trance-like method of drawing. It was kind of the first time as an artist that the process really overwhelmed me. Dare I say it, in a spiritual sense. And maybe it doesn't quite come across in this photo, but I would take a ballpoint pen and just fill in large spaces with just ballpoint pen lines to get a leather texture. And the thought process, like the amount of time that took, became part of thinking about what the layout of a piece would be, as well as it sort of gave me this kind of like mental opening to really start putting thoughts into my drawings as I did them. And it sort of it was like a weird and small and big technical breakthrough for me all at the same time, to think about the way that queer ornamentation has worked, to think about this kind of language, starting with kind of this leather gear, but also looking at other cultures of nicknames, and translating that into my drawing practice, which was still very much based on a resourcefulness of materials, having something as simple as ballpoint pen and paper to work with. It was also around this time, I was living in San Francisco, and my housing was just unstable the entire time I was there, which is part of a long history of housing instability. And I had scrapped together enough to buy this old school bus that I started living in, I think around like 2006 or so. It ran on vegetable oil. It totally crashed my life, but it taught me like an incredible amount about responsibility and envisioning things. It was something where it was so old it constantly needed work, but because of that it was also so simple that I didn't grow up working on cars or anything, but I was able to be like, that's got to be the problem because that's where the smoke is coming out of. And so kind of troubleshooting on the go, and it it very much like kind of collided with a dream of several people, a few of whom I worked with on pilot, but to have kind of an imagining of queer space where small land projects and also kind of rolling homes and queer networks through that as a way of envisioning kind of mobile community and cross networks outside of internet formats. And so my willingness to jump into living on a bus was very much, it was both based in my own kind of housing precarity, but also based in sort of wanting a grander vision of like, how do we connect with each other? What can that look like? How can communities travel to each other? And does it make sense? And in some ways it does, and in a lot of ways it doesn't, to have this totally unwieldy house vehicle. One thing that came from it, though, was I had the bus for about 2 or 3 years, and one of the big kind of final things that happened with it was putting together this kind of queer variety show tour that we took around the East Coast and the Midwest. And it was like this sort of unwieldy, I think there was like usually like 9 to 12 people traveling on the bus at a time. And we just like bring our chaos wherever we were invited or not. It was both this kind of beautiful process. The bus ran on vegetable oil. It was like an era in time. And so there was a whole process of like, we'd have half of our performance crew would be like gathering and processing old oil from restaurants. Half of us would be rehearsing things. I would be driving this beast until I like passed out. And it was this sort of lovely swirl of things. It was also probably the last time I've done a performance that I've considered kind of a formal part of my arts practice. I was sort of a drag adjacent gay Dracula. I performed out of this like plushed coffin and had a little like Dracula costume that was embroidered with buttons. And just like the studded leather, I had been looking at, there's a culture of like pushcart vendors in England who were decorating their suits with pearl buttons. And I had a picture of one on my just kind of wall constantly that said "Original Pearly Queen," because I saw this jacket with a button embroidery that said "Original Pearly Queen," and I was like, "That's my gender. That's it." And I really fell in love with the resourcefulness of that decoration and the beauty of it, the simple beauty of it, and it started coming into my arts practice. Around this time, I was used to having like narrative comics as this Gaylord Phoenix series as sort of this kind of narrative processing that I would do almost on an annual basis. I'd be like, time to make a Gaylord. And I would put out about an issue a year, but also at the same time, narrative started getting looser for me, and my concentration started revolving more around working with this kind of leather drawing technique and seeing where I could stretch it, what it could hold, what it does to find a process that put me into a trance and what could come of that. So those drawings started with the belts and things like that. It really revolved around queer fashions for a while. And again, like at the same time, like narrative was sort of becoming more diffuse in my comics. And then around the end of this time, this kind of tour swarm, the bus broke down beyond repair, like on our way to kind of the last stop of the tour. And it was just this kind of moment where things came to a head, and I had to figure out what happens when things fall apart. For starts, where does the cat go? And the cat came with me. I moved to Chicago and the cat came with me. But just thinking about I have this kind of unwieldy whale of a house bus. My whole artistic practice has become only so it can be contained on this bus, and what kind of spaces can be made on the go, and what happens when I have to land somewhere. And so from that, I ended up returning to Chicago. The bus broke down near Chicago, and I'm from there. I'm from the Chicago suburbs. And so it seemed like it was this moment in the road where I was like, oh, I could try to go anywhere, but Chicago is where I had the most connections to. And I feel like the minute that I landed back there, I started really feeling the city's queer history in this way that I never had before. Felt like it was almost like when it rains and it gets kind of like there's a little bit of like a smoke wafting up from the ground. It felt like that was like what queer history was doing around my feet constantly. I think in part of it is because there's a lot of sort of secret fabulousness to the way things are built. I mean, this is a very bold example of both like this kind of like scrappy repair on this fabulous facade that's a little over the top, and a little of a weird fit, and it's just, I think it's complete spatial magic to my eyes. So both really recognizing this aspect of Chicago architecture where you have something where it's like I don't know, like a dumpy mattress store on the bottom, and then this kind of fabulous like Art Deco, like vibrant, contrasty facade on the top, with like a mystery door to nowhere in the middle of it, like that, like, you know, I feel like it's like details of like a second floor door to nowhere where I'm like, oh, and those patterns on the top floor, like combined with this feeling of like palpable history that I didn't know, led me to kind of cohere with the sort of technique, the ballpoint pen technique that I was doing to draw leather suddenly came into focus as like the background for an architecture. Then thinking about an architecture as something that could hold, at first, queer feelings. When the bus broke down, I moved into my friend Scott's closet and found a lot of humor there. I was like, okay, here we are in the closet, and we're gonna make some gay art. Yeah, I mean, I think this piece very much draws directly from this building. That top ledge really like, and the kind of door to nowhere aspect of it just went directly into this piece called The Threshold in My Closet. And it sort of woke up something in my brain about what drawing spaces could hold, and recognizing in myself that I'm a squirrel, like I'm good at finding a lot of things, I'm good at digging through a lot of stuff, but I'm not necessarily a researcher, I'm not a historian, I'm just not that kind of nerd, but I am definitely some kind of nerd. Like, I'm the sort of person who would like go to like find an old gay magazine and look through all the ads and find this one that was like for the Virgo Out, and I was like, what kind of bar was the Virgo Out? Their logo is amazing, and as a Virgo I was like, well, let's find this place. And so it was sort of this kind of swirl of this history that I didn't know, and also recognizing that like places and spaces and things people have done, even if it feels like it's of like a modest means, like, oh, is a gay bar truly history? Or like, is somebody's like cafe night truly history? And it is, because it also, especially to my trans brain, like that recognition of like, you opened a bar called the Virgo Out. It's a chain with the zodiac. Where is it? And like, to bike to this place, when I found this ad, it was just like a strip mall. It was just totally horrible. It wasn't anything. It definitely wasn't the Virgo Out. And so it led me to kind of the idea of reimagining these spaces, like pulling from these kind of elements of Chicago's architecture where like you're fixing something with duct tape, you have this kind of mismatched siding that you're arranging in a very stylish gay way. And just kind of these aspects of the vernacular architecture of the city were as I was kind of like digging for little clues about what people had done and what the potential for the city and for queer life was based on that. And so, yeah, I started a series called Memory Palaces, and that is like, you know, the formal concept of a memory palace is knowing how to remember something by making a spatial mental map for it. So creating a palace in your mind that as you move through, you remember different aspects of it, which I felt was an idea that ended up having a lot of synergy. Synergy? Sure, yes, for queer community. And also to draw on things that had happened in the city's history, like these little clues, and to put them together as like the potential of queer life. So Chris Studios was a, like it was called physique photos at the time. It was like beef photos of semi-nude men's. Yeah, it was like a fairly public business that ended up like branching out, and like currently, you know, like you have these iterations in Chicago, like the route of the leather archive in Chicago is Chris Studios. And also sort of, it gave me the freedom to both like pull from historic spaces that had been in Chicago, as well as using kind of like vernacular architecture to make a gay building of my dreams. Essentially, like, I feel like when thinking about the pilot conference, it was really thinking about, in a lot of ways, like working with other people and thinking about like, how do we think about queerness? How do we think about our trans bodies? And how do we expand those definitions? And how do we also play with those? Like, what if a conference is a television studio? And this got to be me like being like, oh, like what if all the like kind of weird faded signage, the like yellow painted like auto parts store, what if they all came together and it just ended up being this kind of mysterious queer club? So working with kind of these under-noticed architectural details of the city and forming these facades that I wanted people as like viewers to enter into and sort of be absorbed by. Another thing that the Memory Palaces really offered me was, at the time, it was a pretty painful year as well, where there was a lot of loss. A lot of people I know passed away in like a 2-year period. And I found that the kind of detail intensity, the sort of trance-like leather texture that you see in the background, which I was still doing by ballpoint pen, ended up being how I mourned and kind of honored friends and artists who passed away. So this is a gateway for the artist Mark Aguilar, and this is a gateway for the artist Flo McGarrell, who did the inflatable TV in one of the earlier slides, the early pilot slide. And just thinking about sorry, it still makes me a little sad. The possibility of this technique and what it had offered me. It offered me the mental space and kind of the physical activity to mourn someone, and to also try to honor them, to get back to sort of thinking about, can art be gift making? Can art be thinking about ways and whys of making things? Yeah, and this period, after I had the bus, my comics work really sort of dropped away in a lot of ways. Like, things about it dispersed to kind of recongeal. But thinking about like narrative and performance just sort of fell through my fingers like grains of sand. But I was still interested in illustration and graphic work. This is a gender-neutral bathroom sign that was designed for the dance party Chances that happened in Chicago. And that was a dance party that really thought about what are the parameters of a dance party and what can a dance party do? And looking at queer ways of thinking about expanding a nightlife into social practice and community. So when I went back to comics, they were a little bit, I mean, they were already weird, but they got a little stringier, I would say. I was really thinking about how we're kind of a community of parts, our bodies, our microbiomes is, I guess, how we would say it now, but also interspecies relations and how that relates to queer community. So the Gaylord books, I started drawing them again. They became much more like ecosexual. And sort of Gaylord's narrative almost started coming to a natural conclusion, which was this collected graphic novel that came out in 2009, I think. So which collected like the first 6 issues that I had put out, and sort of by the time it was over, I was like, am I making the same gay fantasy comic over and over again? And the answer was no, but I think it also like let me, it released me from this narrative that had taught me a lot about my body and about being a trans person in space. And then it sort of let me draw whatever I wanted. I started comics called Clowns that were much more collagey and loose. I started drawing comics that were just essentially based on like Halloween decorations. But really, like, I would do that to kind of unwind, and then sort of the heart of my practice was becoming more and more like drawing and painting and thinking about why paint, why draw architecture, why draw spaces, and what can those hold? And for me, they started holding like just the word salad of my mind. Like this is called Pride Route, and it's based on just these feelings of the infuriating restraint and officialdom of like pride marches, and also this like aspect of celebration and also aspect of coming together. And it just felt like, I don't know, pride parades felt like the worst time of year. It was the worst of times, it was the best of times. The kind of thinking through what does a parade hold and what does it restrain, and putting that into this weird little orange drawing here. And then sort of exploding that architecture. This was like, I guess the memory palaces came out, and I was like, oh, like these spaces are so rich and they hold so much. And I started talking about how I made them, and also the drawing technique that I used for them. And the more that I sort of started explaining being able to access kind of a trance or a weird mental state for making and thinking, the less it was actually like functioning as a practice when I was doing it. Instead, my wrists were just hurting. Eventually I like just had to recognize that like, oh, like as an artist, like I come into things that really work for my ideas, and then I have to recognize when I outgrow them and kind of extend my idea, like try to pull the core of my ideas that still feel true and work in a different way. So still working with kind of a architectural platform, but also releasing myself from these kind of intense, I call them leather backgrounds, the ballpoint pen like fill-in that had meant so much to me, and its like texture and variation, its touchability. Being able to like be like, well, that was part of those spaces, and now I have to make space that maybe doesn't have that trance aspect to it. And because I had to let that go, I think the sort of core of thinking about like, oh, what is queer space? And in a lot of ways, to me, it means visualizing something that feels impossible in the world that we're in now, and trying to recognize that by visualizing something and putting your ideas into it, it's a little closer to a world that I want to be in. And also shifting what the architecture I was drawing was doing. I started with these kind of historic spaces and places from Chicago. It felt very needed for me to kind of understand the city I was in, but also very, it's like a beautiful terrarium. And I started shifting what the architecture was holding. This piece is called Just a Stage. referencing the kind of dismissal, especially of trans identity, that I certainly got from family and friends, and thinking about that as like these like ephemeral queer idea spaces and bringing attention to it, honoring it, and trying to complicate it. This piece is called The Blood Bank. And again, like using this kind of ornate architecture to spend time with, for me, this felt very much linked to kind of growing up in the 80s, where you had HIV/AIDS very much in the news, and being a child then, and also kind of recognizing my own queerness and seeing as it related to that, and also like reckoning with family blood ties. So trying to push this kind of these amorphous ideas I had of identity and personal history into a drawing, and finding space for that by drawing like spaces. So my work became very much about queer identity and queer ideas as like shifted into places, shifted into fantasy architecture. This piece is called Gender Changer, and was about sort of, I had engaged in medical transitioning and then sort of backed away from it because of health stuff, and then was kind of on the cusp of re-entering it, but also finding that it was, at least at this time, this was like around 2014, and where I was at, it felt very locked into binary definitions of gender and how you could engage with that. And not that there wasn't flexibility in it, but it felt like I wanted to draw a drawing that had these kind of 2 columns of windows, and a very institutional but also ornate kind of design to it. And so it's a weird way to get my ideas and feelings out, but also felt very like finding my my thinking, drawing intuition on things, and putting them into architectures, and also breaking those apart. Because a drawing can do things that a built building can't, and which I think makes it like this excellent medium for visualizing possibility. This piece is called Retention Pond, and it is about gaps in my memory. And it also was sort of a bridge piece. All the work that we've seen up to this point is pretty much work on paper, drawings with gouache painting. And around this time I like shifted, the outlines fell away, just like the kind of leather background as a drawing technique. I would say that a lot of drawing fell away for me around this time, and the architecture became less architecture but more bodily. This piece is a space called the Bindery, and it was about binding my chest for years and years, and this kind of chaotic tension of that sort of alteration of the self. Yep. And these kind of paintings, when the outlines fell away, obviously it's still something I made, but it was an interesting, I feel like these had a much more like, they felt very much like honing in rather than the city's history. I felt like I was making these buildings about my own body. So this is the tea room. It was about going back on testosterone in a different way, and kind of weird. I had sort of identified like 5 major phases of like emotional feeling about it, and the forms kind of like are trying to echo that in a way. This one is called Double Keyhole, which was the sort of chest surgery I had had, and trying to make a cathedral out of that, and trying to think about what, to capture like a physical sensation of having that surgery, that I feel like when I would try to explain it in words, like if I tried to break it down in words right now, I would feel like I was lying, or like I didn't have true words for it, but I could come up with a true visual for it. So in this kind of shifting more towards painting, away from drawing, very much like using a visual to find a language for something that I didn't have language for before. Yeah. And yeah, I feel like the abstractness of being of being a human being came into play, and like the boundaries that identity has around it. I feel like I am especially looking at it through a trans lens. It can feel like gender both becomes concrete and then gets very abstract. And I can see that in the sort of almost the breathing pattern of my painting work now, where things can congeal into shapes, recognizable shapes, and then they can get sort of release into an abstraction. On the concrete side of things, this sort of shift in my work was happening. Donald Trump got elected. I moved out to around Joshua Tree out in the California desert. And there was this moment out there where there was like, I was driving home one day and there was like this site that you have to pass by on the highway, and it had like an actual, like an anti-trans political billboard on it. It was really, truly awful. I ended up like, at first I was like, ugh, sucks. I don't care. But then I found myself driving like an hour out of my way to just not look at it. And that was true for a lot of my queer community and trans community out in the desert. Like we were all kind of like, ugh, like sucks. But then also like it was a big psychic oppression. It just sucked. But I feel like through that, like there was this kind of cohesion of people talking about, well, what do we do about this? We were able to fundraise and design together and put up a trans affirming billboard. So just, my work was getting more abstract, but also I don't feel like I ever want to feel like I'm divorced from a community practice and engaging in working with others, because I feel like it helps alleviate the misery. And around this time, like, was also this kind of narrative came back to me, and I started drawing Gaylord again. I feel like there's something in, maybe I was talking about this right before the lecture too, like there's part of me that feels very trickster oriented, that I love wordplay, I love jokes, I love playfulness with language, I love stretching the boundaries of things. And I felt like everything around 2016, 2018 felt so contracted, and still to this day does with our political climate, legislation. It can be easy to forget joy and the joyfulness and messiness of community and our collective trouble. And so I don't know. I feel like the new Gaylord issues, I think maybe are a little like corny in some ways, but also trying to respond to that and try to be like, ugh, there's joy in the world. And introducing like new communities into these kind of fantasy comics and seeing where they can take Gaylord and other characters. It sort of also ended up being this moment in time where I was asked to take some of the kind of architectural investigations I was doing and get them into an architectural scale. So this is a plan for a mural. It's based on a organization called The Labyrinth, which was the first kind of newsletter for trans men in the US. I don't think it was ever anything more than like a P.O. box address that you could send to and get a newsletter back. But it really resonated with me in its name, that the labyrinth, where I was like, oh, the labyrinth's so good, because I felt like navigating transmasculine identity felt very maze-like for me. And I wanted to make a building facade that honored that. And so this was installed in the stairway of the Drawing Center in New York City, and it was a hand-painted mural, and it was my first time kind of working at this scale and getting to see what a facade looks like when it is as big as I designed it, or as big as a building would be. This is also another mural project that came kind of right at the end of it, or right after it, that was this huge wall, like 60 feet across, and in Berkeley at BAMPFA, and thinking about, I had just gone through helping a friend of mine out in the desert find housing. They're a trans elder. And thinking about how under-resourced housing is for the elderly, and especially for some queer elders who have had to make choices in their lives to live in their identity at the sacrifice of other securities. And so, designing this facade, I wanted to have this building that was full of kind of mystery and joy, and specifically needed. And then I feel like the kind of windiness of this architecture came into sort of the abstraction of these sort of body paintings I was making. And then also at time, and then has had the opportunity to be reflected back into this kind of mural work. So this was kind of a surprise job. I was asked to do a mural at Facebook in LA. And I was like, ugh, what am I gonna do for Facebook? One thing that I've been really interested in is the aspect of what lives in a language and what isn't in a language, and how do you get the unspoken things into language. And with our kind of reliance and absorption in digital culture, like thinking about what it means where you have a root language of that is binary, and how do you break that? How do you understand that you can have this language that is so ultimately binary, and what does that do to digital formats? And how do you even think about non-binary and paradoxical existences within that framework? So this piece is called Can Binary Code Sing a Non-Binary Song?, which has these kind of black and white designs interrupted by these color parties. And is based on kind of reflecting on that idea of, can non-binary responses be built into a binary language? And then I had done a bunch of murals. The COVID-19 pandemic hit, and for a minute, it just was a complete re-examination of why make art when you really need to know how to grow a tomato and, change capitalism. And so it sort of took a minute of processing for me to come back to painting during pandemic. And when I did, I was really interested in how things come together and fall apart, and to find formats and spaces that can do that with flexibility, that can do that with joy, and can do that with playfulness. I'm still living out in the desert, and I was looking a lot at microscopic sand particle, like photographs of sand at high resolution, and these kind of arrangements of geometries and forms. And I started thinking about the sandcastle as sort of a metaphor for queer resourcefulness and queer community, and these kind of buildings that are built with the knowledge that they wash away, but yet are built with joy and built as fabulous as we want them to be, and as resourcefully as we want them to be, with the knowledge that it doesn't have to be something that lasts through time. And this like sort of messy pile of culture that we're wading through. Yeah, and to relate back to that picture of rags that we looked at first, like it really helped me to have like piles of glitter that I would sift through, and I started collaging with it as in reflection to the sandcastles, and kind of pulling together these constructions that are about time and timeliness and resourcefulness. And these collages about a similar thing, about a lot of things coming together in something that is fundamentally unstable, but also filled with, I'm going to say filled with wonder, although I know it's corny. And looking at these architectures, these fantasy architectures, as ways of sort of visualizing these spaces. And yeah, I guess we're moving into kind of where my practice currently stands, which is trying to pry deeper into both sand and desert ecology, the water of the desert, the queer body and what it holds, the amalgamation of parts, the abstraction of gender, the spaces that visualizing something can hold, the weird community of it all, and looking at these sort of this sort of space making and placement as like a way of synthesizing ideas and ways of thinking and ways of living. Yeah, so this we're just I know I'm a little bit out of time, but this is just a few shots of recent paintings and sort of the direction. These kind of little clues, like I feel like I'll work on a few paintings at once, and it always kind of gives me like breadcrumbs to the next thing. There's always something that's sort of falling apart in my work, and something that is opening a new little portal. And thinking about being a weird body in time and space with you all. And I think that's it. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much. I think, sure, yeah. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to quack further about anything, everything, something. In the back?
Yeah. Do you have a process for picking your color schemes? Like, why do you choose the colors that you choose? Or is it just because they look good?
Yeah. I don't have like a code where I'm like, oh, I use red when I'm angry. But I think my color selection, especially with the memory palaces and that kind of body of drawings, started with when I saw engaging color palettes in the world, I would sort of write down notes about them. I'd be like, ooh, really bright blue, really pale green, brick red, no orange, purple, purple, purple. Or, you know, like I'd have like these weird written lists of colors to combine. And then I think through those, like through working with those kind of combinations of the world, like that I was pulling out from the world, the recent paintings, I feel like some of those have kind of solidified into a palette that I'm interested in working with right now, because I feel like it feels very light-filled to me, and seeing how those things play up against each other. I grew up in a home with a lot of like Eastern European folk art too. And so I feel like there's something about that maybe like sings to me a little bit in that way with the colors I'm using. But it's like I feel like I'll make lists of colors, but I'm never afraid to like be like, oh, but maybe we'll toss this all away and add some pink or something, you know, like it's open-ended. Cool. Yeah. Mostly now it is gouache paint on wood panel, but in the past, whatever I could get my hands on. Yes?
Thank you for your talk, first of all. And I found particularly fascinating the connection that you made between ornament, decoration, architecture, and gender. And so I'd like to ask you if you could expand a little bit more about this relationship and how it's articulated in your practice.
Yeah. I mean, I think from growing up queer and having these kind of moments of recognition of seeing it in culture, it seemed like there was always something that was a little ornate that I was recognizing. There was something draggy about it in my like recognition, where I was like, ooh, I'm with that. Like that's something that's sparking something of, and so I think that there's an association with that, where like I would be biking through the city and be like, that building looks so gay to me. And, you know, it would be these architectural details that had something maybe a little weird about them, or a little like ruined, or just something really fancy, and kind of that like cross-pollination of being part of a queer scene that had sort of a draggy aspect to it, and recognizing the spillover of kind of queer resourcefulness and fashion in the world at large, that I think brought in architectural ornamentation to my work and felt like such a natural space-making tool for me. And I think it also, I mean, it fed into seeing the way that there was this ornamentation that was ignored, fed into, in Chicago, recognizing that there was like a cultural history that was being ignored, and that I didn't know that in the streets.
What would be like the most ideal physical manifestation of your work going forward? Like, you don't already have like a commission underway that is that. Like, what would the dream be?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the dream would be like, ultimately, I think, excessive and collaborative space. You know, like working with people in built environments, and creating community use spaces that were also like very visually fabulous, you know, and seeing how those things can kind of sing together. And it's, I don't know, I think it's also something where at the same time, at my root, I feel myself as a painter because I can visualize impossible things that can't be built. I can paint them. And there's something that feels very equally as productive about that as like kind of these large scale murals and built out environments. And so, yeah, I guess a little of each, cautiously. Anyone else? Cool. Glad I answered it all, huh? Thank you so much.